You really thought you could get away with that, didn't you? She said, her voice dripping with a sickly sweet triumph that made my stomach clench. The words hung in the air between us, a tangible weight in the otherwise festive atmosphere of my engagement party. My life before that moment had been a tapestry of muted colors, a quiet existence woven with threads of obligation and a relentless, low hum of underlying tension. My family, particularly my sister, Sarah, was a masterclass in passive aggression and covert manipulation. We lived in a sprawling, old house that belonged to our parents, a house that felt less like a home and more like a gilded cage where unspoken resentments festered like mold behind the antique wallpaper. Sarah, 2 years my senior, had always been the golden child, the one who effortlessly navigated social minefields, the one whose every whim was catered to. I, on the other hand, was the quiet observer, the one who swallowed my own needs to maintain a fragile peace. It was a role I'd perfected over years, a silent pact to avoid the inevitable storms her displeasure would unleash. My fiancé, Mark, was a breath of fresh air, a grounded presence who saw through the charade, but even his unwavering support couldn't fully shield me from the insidious nature of my family's dynamics. Sarah's entitlement wasn't a sudden bloom, it was a deeply rooted tree that had been growing for years, its branches heavy with the fruits of her self-importance. I remembered vividly the summer after college, when our grandmother passed. While I was coordinating with the funeral director and helping my grieving parents, Sarah was already planning her inheritance distribution with our aunt, discussing which pieces of jewelry she'd always admired and making impassioned pleas for the antique writing desk. She'd done it with such practiced innocence, a little pout on her lips, that our mother, weary and lost, had barely registered the thinly veiled greed. Then there was the incident with my first car, a modest sedan I'd saved for with every spare penny. Sarah, whose own car was always newer and flashier, had borrowed mine for a weekend trip. She returned it with a significant dent in the passenger door and a casual shrug. "Oh, yeah, some idiot bumped me in the parking lot," she'd said, not bothering to offer an apology or a plan to fix it. She knew I couldn't afford the repairs immediately, and the unspoken implication was that I would somehow absorb the cost without complaint. It was a small thing, a dent in a car, but it was the pattern, the casual disregard for my possessions, my effort, my very existence, that chipped away at me, day after day. I'd let it go, of course. The alternative, a full-blown confrontation with Sarah, complete with tears, accusations, and the inevitable involvement of our parents taking her side, was a price I was never willing to pay. The wedding planning was a whirlwind, a kaleidoscope of colors, fabrics, and guest lists. It was supposed to be the culmination of years of quiet longing, the beginning of a life built on love and mutual respect. Mark and I had poured our hearts and savings into making it perfect. We'd envisioned a celebration that reflected our joy, a testament to our commitment witnessed by everyone we held dear. Sarah, of course, had inserted herself into every aspect, her suggestions often bordering on demands, her criticisms thinly veiled as helpful advice. She had a particular obsession with the champagne toast, insisting that the best vintage was crucial for the visual impact. I'd acquiesced, wanting to avoid any further friction, already feeling the familiar dread of an impending conflict. She'd even offered to be the one to personally oversee the champagne service, a seemingly selfless gesture that, in hindsight, was the first flicker of the fire she was about to ignite. The day dawned, a perfect canvas of blue sky and gentle warmth. The ceremony was everything we dreamed of, emotional, joyous, and filled with heartfelt vows. The reception hall was breathtaking, a symphony of fairy lights, floral arrangements, and the murmur of delighted conversation. 300 of our closest friends and family members filled the space, their faces alight with celebration. Mark and I, flushed with happiness, moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations, basking in the glow of our commitment. Then came the moment for the toast. I'd chosen a small, intimate table near the head table, a private space for Mark, myself, and our parents. Sarah had positioned herself nearby, a glass of champagne already in hand, her eyes sparkling with an intensity that was a little unnerving. As Mark raised his glass, I reached for mine. It was then that I noticed the subtle difference in the liquid. It was cloudy, with an almost imperceptible shimmer that hadn't been there when the glasses were poured. A wave of nausea washed over me. I looked at Sarah. She met my gaze, and in her eyes, I saw it, a flicker of something dark and triumphant, a knowing smirk that sent a jolt of ice through my veins. She gave me a tiny, almost imperceptible nod, as if to say, the room seemed to blur. I could hear the clinking of glasses, the murmurs of well-wishers, but it was all distant, muffled. My senses zeroed in on the tainted liquid, the subtle cloying sweetness that hinted at something wrong. Sarah, oblivious to the dawning horror on my face, or perhaps relishing it, raised her glass higher. "To the happy couple," she announced, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed anticipation. The champagne trickled down my throat, tasting strangely metallic, with an unwelcome, cloying sweetness. My hand trembled. Mark looked at me, a question in his eyes. I managed a weak smile, my mind racing, trying to process the sheer audacity of her act. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. She hadn't just spiked my drink, she had done it in front of everyone, a public declaration of her contempt. The warmth of the celebration evaporated, replaced by a chilling clarity. This wasn't about a drunken prank or a misguided attempt at humor. This was calculated, deliberate, and deeply personal. I excused myself from the table, murmuring something about needing air, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I needed to think. I needed to act. The next few days were a blur of frantic, hushed phone calls and strained silences. Sarah, predictably, played the victim, feigning confusion and hurt when questioned by our parents. She'd spun a narrative of me being overly sensitive, of misinterpreting her playful gesture. My parents, ever eager to avoid conflict, had leaned towards her version, their placating words doing little to soothe the burning injustice I felt. But the seed of my decision had been planted, watered by years of her entitlement and culminating in that public humiliation. I didn't want to scream, I didn't want to fight. I wanted precision. I wanted a consequence that mirrored the cold calculation of her act. I remembered the wedding contract, the one I'd meticulously reviewed with our lawyer before signing. It was a standard vendor agreement, but buried deep within the clauses was a force majeure clause, designed to protect us from unforeseen circumstances that could impact the event. I also remembered a conversation with our wedding planner, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Eleanor, who had insisted on certain clauses regarding vendor behavior and client satisfaction. Sarah, in her obsessive need to control every aspect of the wedding, had taken it upon herself to liaise with the champagne supplier, a boutique vineyard whose product was renowned for its exclusivity and price tag. She'd signed off on the order, adding her own personal note about ensuring peak quality. On Monday morning, I walked into Eleanor's office, my mind clear, my resolve set. I laid out the events of the wedding day, the specific details of Sarah's actions, and the evidence I'd discreetly gathered, a small, sealed vial of the tainted champagne I'd managed to retrieve, and the supplier's invoice which Sarah had insisted on paying from a joint account she'd set up for wedding expenses. Eleanor listened intently, her expression unreadable. She then pulled up the contract, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "Interesting," she murmured, a glint in her eye. "The supplier's contract has a rather strict clause regarding misrepresentation and intentional damage to product reputation. Coupled with your sister's personal instructions regarding peak quality, this becomes rather compelling." She made a few calls, her voice calm and authoritative. She spoke of breach of contract, of reputational damage, of significant financial penalties. She didn't raise her voice, didn't sound angry, but the calm professionalism was more terrifying than any outburst. I watched as Eleanor meticulously documented every detail, the objective facts building an undeniable case. I then asked her about the financial implications for the supplier, and the responsibility that might fall on the individual who directly interacted with them. Eleanor explained that the supplier, facing a potential lawsuit and significant damage to their own reputation, would likely seek to recoup their losses from the party that directly engaged them and caused the breach. Sarah, who had insisted on managing that particular aspect, had inadvertently signed her own financial ruin. The next few weeks were a masterclass in quiet destruction. Eleanor, acting on my behalf, presented the champagne supplier with a detailed account of Sarah's actions. They, in turn, initiated legal proceedings against her, not the wedding couple, but Sarah personally. The cost of the champagne, combined with punitive damages for reputational harm and breach of contract, amounted to a sum that Sarah, despite her perceived privilege, could not possibly afford. Her PR otists were met with cold, legal jargon. Her attempts to blame me were dismissed as irrelevant to the contractual obligations she had personally undertaken. The meticulously crafted facade of her respectability began to crumble. The frantic texts started appearing in my inbox, then Mark's. Sarah's flying monkeys, a cadre of her equally entitled friends and distant relatives, began their campaign. They painted me as a vengeful shrew, a sister who had ruined Sarah's life over a silly mistake. They called, they emailed, they cornered Mark's parents at social events. But the more they railed against me, the more detached I became. I had acted with precision, not malice. I had simply allowed the consequences of her actions to unfold, unhindered by my own attempts to smooth things over, as I had done for so many years. Sarah's initial arrogance gave way to desperation. She tried to negotiate, to offer repayment plans that were laughable given the scale of the damages. She even attempted to leverage family loyalty, appealing to my parents for intervention. But this time, my parents, confronted with concrete legal documents and the very real threat of financial ruin for their beloved daughter, were forced to acknowledge the gravity of the situation. The golden child's shine had dulled considerably. The social fallout was immense. The friends who had once courted her now distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with her financial scandal. Her carefully curated image of effortless success was shattered, replaced by the stark reality of her debt and her recklessness. The $80,000 wedding was a distant memory, a symbol of a beginning that had almost been poisoned. But the true cost, I realized, wasn't monetary. It was the years of self-neglect, the emotional toll of constantly appeasing her, the slow erosion of my own self-worth. In the end, the quiet execution of justice wasn't about revenge, it was about reclamation. It was about finally drawing a boundary, not with words, but with the irrefutable force of her own accountability. The silence that followed her downfall was profound. It was the sound of peace, hard-won and deeply satisfying. And in that quiet, I finally began to hear the echo of my own voice.